Now we start the second day of the conference with a keynote address from Peter Polowski on knowledge management in post-pandemic times. Professor Peter Polowski is currently a senior research professor on the domains of team and knowledge management at Chemnitz University of Technology in Germany.
So the title of my presentation, as you see, is KM in post-pandemic times. Maybe I was a bit too optimistic about this, but with the ongoing vaccination, and we do hope some people are going to be convinced about this, we'll be able to embrace post-pandemic times soon. So the idea of my presentation here is to give a subjective, and that's what I'm really pronouncing, a subjective narrative based on 40 years of research in knowledge management and ECKM. And part of the research team that contributed to this paper are Stephanie Tietz and Nina Flugfelder, two PhD students almost crossing the line now in my institute in Chemnitz. And yes, they're also been involved in this paper. So the overview I'm giving you will address 3 points. One, past, so a little bit question about history, the presence, and some possible future topics of knowledge management. And it is really a high altitude perspective with low scientific granularity and detail, but on the other side, the possibility to draw a big picture, sort of looking at the development of our field from a bird's view and from a very subjective, of course, and selective angle. So part of the history is, of course, very, very selective. So with regard to the past, I'd like to propose 6 phases of knowledge management approaches. And secondly, we'll have a short glimpse at the present topics in KM based on a bibliographical analysis. So that's what you guys are doing at the moment, or we're all together doing at the moment. And thirdly, I'd like to suggest 4 fields of growing importance of knowledge management research in the future. So let's start off with the historical overview. Those are the agenda points, development, bibliometric overview, today's research, and future focus fields. So when I started off studying knowledge management in the 80s, I tried to compile a little bit on this basic and this history of my own research. So when I studied knowledge management or started studying knowledge management in the 80s, I ran across a lot of literature on organizational learning and organization theory. And if you look at the history of KM in the net and Google and so on, you'll find some roots of KM which are supposed to be in information science, which I do not think is totally correct. I think there's a lot of roots in KM found in organizational theory. So let's jump into the 70s and have a look. So you see this picture of people riding bicycle on a German highway. And that was on the so-called car-free Sundays. And this was not, as you probably remember, some of you remember, this was not due to natural scarcity of oil, but was in response to the American decision to support the Israelis during the Yom Kippur War. And in October 73, the members of the OPEC, of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, they imposed an oil embargo on the Western world, and the world suddenly had to cope with a drastic oil shortage. So, okay, what's that got to do with knowledge management? For many companies, this was not so amusing as riding bicycle on German motorways. I don't know how you experienced or how your countries have experienced this crisis, which was one of the first crises after the Second World War. And a large number of companies were caught up in the swirl, and many companies went bankrupt. So if you look at the statistics of bankruptcies in German small and medium-sized companies from 59 to 77, you see a sharp increase from 73. We have figures of around 27% per year of bankruptcies in SMEs. So the deep crisis now came without warning and caught many companies completely off guard. Now this is storytelling. Now there's a story about the Royal Dutch Shell, which you probably know. A young manager by the name of Arie de Goys, was corporate planning director at that time, together with Pierre Wack in Great Britain and Graham Gaylor. They were all part of the scenario planning teams. They've been influenced by Herman Kahn, who had been experimenting with scenario planning techniques in the Rand Corporation in the 50s already. And they introduced a method of scenario learning to the Royal Dutch Shell. And since the end of the 60s, Shell had implemented regular scenario planning workshops at the top management level. So they went offsite somewhere with top management and posed a scenario okay, what would happen if oil supplies would completely slump tomorrow? So management laughed and found it was a funny idea, and they joined in developing the scenario over the weekend. So after the oil crisis, the Royal Dutch Shell had done exceptionally well compared to its competitors. So whether this was due to the fact that they've been implementing scenario planning, of course, cannot be scientifically proven or empirically tested. But many observers, including Graham Gaylor, whom I had a chance to work with in a Daimler-Benz Foundation project, they attributed the high internal flexibility of the top management's mental models due to this internal reflexivity. And they were able to cope with very, very different environmental scenarios. So at least, coming back sort of from storytelling, at the very least, the severe crisis was a turning point with regard to companies' outlook and the necessity to learn from changing environments. And one of the most frequent quotes you find is Arie de Gooi's quote, which I find in many master theses or PhDs concerning or working about organizational learning and knowledge management. The ability to learn faster than your competitors may be the only sustainable competitive advantage. Now, this was new, indeed, because questioning the widespread of long-range planning and understanding the instability and complexity of business environments was really new at that time. So in parallel, in organizational theory, we have a lot of concepts, all these Duncan, Emery Trist, Lawrence Lorsch, Anzov Child talking about complexity, about insecurity, environmental turbulence, and so on. But looking in detail into organizational theory, we can see that, for example, with the conception of Syard and March in '63 already, they had described the so-called standard operating procedures, which is seen as the memory of the organization in his behavioral theory of the firm. And later, March Simon developed on this and so on. And in their understanding, only successful behavior and decision rules, they also had attention rules and different other types of rules, which they conceptualized, and only successful rules are reproduced in the future so organizations learn from their experiences. And this, to me, is maybe one of the most fundamental interpretation of knowledge in the context of corporate and management behavior, and the basis of later approaches of the resource-based view and so on. From this behavioristic, because with stimulus response view approach, the cognitive tradition evolved, and you see on the right numerous concepts of organizational knowledge systems, like, for example, Argers's organizational action theory, or organizational intelligence from Vilensky, or frames of reference from Srivastava Mitrov, or organizational minds from Sandlands and Stablan, and so on. And many others, they refer to organizational knowledge and the question of how it is created, distributed, stored, and used in organizations for decision making. Well, to me, organizational learning and knowledge management are two sides of a coin that have the same root in this organizational and knowledge theory. Now, jumping one step further, we come to a phase, I think, and these phases are not sequential, of course, but there's some influences that had come newly into the picture, I think. In this phase, I just labeled job demand perspective, because I find there's a lot of literature that understands knowledge management as a fulfilling of organizational demands and requirements. And if we look at one very typical definition at that time from Odell and others, knowledge management is therefore a conscious strategy of getting the right knowledge to the right people at the right time and helping people share and put information into action in ways that strive to improve organizational performance. So you have certain demands derived from the organizational structures, systems, or technologies. You have sort of this circle, and then you have the human potential and the knowledge and the qualifications, and you adapt the knowledge of the employees to the given requirements of the job, of the work system. And what's important here, I think, is the redundant knowledge, the learning motivation, the know-how that people had, apart from required qualifications, didn't play any role. They were non-existent. And there wasn't any space in the concepts to deal with them. Parallel in this phase, in this second phase, we see a number of process models coming up. In parallel to the demand perspective, Mandel, Nonaka, Probst, Bourgeois, Epler, and many others developed sort of based on cybernetic thinking and control loop thinking, developed sort of concepts that had the concern of identifying, generating, sharing, organizing, storing knowledge in organizations and using them in respect to organizational goal. And that was a real decisive difference there, because the decisive factor in these models is a new perspective, that knowledge management was no longer just a question of individual adaptation to certain workplaces, but that it was related to the requirements and strategies of the organization as a whole. Remember Probst and others making these process models and basing them in organizational knowledge strategy. So quasi for the first time, the collective knowledge related to organizational knowledge goals and strategies, and this played an important role. So jumping with 7 mile boots to the next phase, I think we come to an influence where we have distribution of knowledge, technology, tools, IC assessment were major topics. And from the mid of the 90s, maybe, we witness a professionalization and primarily technology-oriented approaches. So skills management, knowledge distribution approaches were increasingly supported with IT tools. We find knowledge engineering platforms, yellow pages, skill management systems, and so on. And the basic understanding here is that knowledge is explicit, accessible, and countable. So give you an example. The focus in large organizations, which I worked together with closely over many years, for example, Airbus or Volkswagen and so on, were almost exclusively on focused on explicit knowledge. And they identified knowledge along a value chain. So this was one aspect here that I'd like to go into a little bit. Knowledge here represents a raw resource, which, similar to a natural raw material or preliminary product, is transported to the relevant operational processing stations in order to support the value creation. So the Fraunhofer were very active in Germany, developing these so-called business process-oriented knowledge management models, where they sort of addressed knowledge which was needed at certain production stations and developed methods for getting knowledge exactly to these points. Another example I'd like to mention in this phase was in Volkswagen plant in Wolfsburg. In the early 90s, they had a department with the abbreviation of WWDECK, WWDEC. And this stands for Worldwide Development and Exchange of Corporate Knowledge. It was a large department, and they developed highly creative tools for internal knowledge management, starting with yellow pages, community networks, knowledge relays, just to name some most successful tools. Now, interestingly enough, I had a speech and a little project in another Volkswagen plant about 10 years later. And there was no clue whatsoever that Volkswagen had ever developed these tools, so much for storing information about knowledge management in organizations. So it's so strongly connected to the people, the environments, the problems they have in certain situations. Just imagine 10 years later, this company has no memory whatsoever of these departments that had developed and used very successfully knowledge management tools. Okay, they had other problems, I agree. Now, in parallel to these practical advancements, a renaissance of knowledge valuation attempts took place around the end of the 90s. Now, building on human resource accounting from Likert and others, there was an important trigger, and that was the Ricardas project. And I think the Ricardas project really gave a momentum to the whole thing, because a number of people met, and maybe not so the results of the Ricardas project were so important, but much more the continuous working together on these ideas. And there were, I think, amongst others, but 2 main trends evolving from the Ricardas project. And one was the intellectual capital accounting approach in Europe, which was anchored around the University of Ferrara, around Stefano Sambon. And the intention here was clearly to develop quantitative analysis of annual reports and so on. And the second grouping was around the 3 founders of the New Club of Paris, Leif Edmondson, Ahmed Bonfour, and Günter Koch, who were all involved in different types of knowledge management activities. And they founded the Club of Rome, the Club of Paris, sorry, along the ideas of following the ideas of the Club of Rome. And the club's aim was then to support nations, regions, cities, communities, and organizations in their transformation to the knowledge society. And this involved a large dissemination of knowledge management thinking in different aspects for years to come, I think. One close cooperation for years was the cooperation with the World Bank that followed the so-called ECKM methodology, which was knowledge assessment methodology developed, and they developed this KEI, the Knowledge Economy Index, on national levels. And the idea, I think, was very innovative to track the developments of all OECD countries towards a knowledge and information society with a completely new set of indicators. Instead of using a gross domestic product as sort of the indicator of success of Western societies, they sort of thought it was important to focus on other details. Now, numerous national and international products evolved from from these ideas, and many projects were done on organizations, on cities, on regions and countries, and the importance of knowledge. Let me just give you a short example. The German Ministry of Economics, they had a large consortium project over more than 5 years, where they developed tools and valuation of intellectual capital in the so-called knowledge balance sheet, following Günter Koch's idea in the Austrian Research Center in Seibersdorf. And the original intention, which is quite funny and interesting, the original intention of the German ministry then was to give companies empirical evidence for the value of their intangible capital in order to negotiate with their banks about loans and credits. And this never worked out. But the implementation of intellectual capital reporting in these SMEs showed that intangible balance sheets was a very, very strong strategic development process implementing these. And I frequently participated in these IC evaluations, and it was not so much about the valuing intangible capital or directing knowledge from one place to another. It was much more about the insight of knowledge importance in their companies. So in these meetings and IC evaluation workshops, it was stunning to see how suddenly CEOs, it became apparent and clear to them that their strategy development was connected to intangible resources and human capital. In other words, to knowledge management. So if you ask them what would happen if one of your middle management important persons wouldn't come to the job tomorrow, it really became suddenly clear for them how strong their whole operation, their value production was dependent on knowledge assets. And at this time also we have, of course, the reception of Nonaka's and Takeuchi's book on knowledge development. And the question more and more came up, how can we develop knowledge strategies and new knowledge in our organizations? And here, to me, for the first time, the clear limitations of a simplistic, rational, objective, IT-based storing of information concepts became apparent. In my view, it can be generalized from this phase that knowledge management is in the sense of reflexive management, that it requires a dialogic culture in which people reflect on experiences, successes, and failures, and so on. And then we come to the turn of the millennium, and knowledge management became more about developing a culture of knowledge sharing. So I labeled this competitiveness, strategic management, experiential knowledge. So at this time, the complexity and turbulence of the environments grew even more. We were now speaking of a VUCA world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And here the resource knowledge became a potential competitive factor more than ever. Now, based on the resource-based view, competence-based view, knowledge-based view, and so on, it became increasingly clear that its specific core competencies, Leonard Barton or Hamal Prahalat, competitive advantages, that make up a company's strategic competitive advantage. And knowledge was thus the result of a specific collective learning history. I mean, looking at Mintzberg's crafting strategy, for example, knowledge was thus the result of a specific collective learning history. And Barney had coined the phrase causal ambiguity before in his theory in 91. And causal ambiguity is a result of a series of interaction processes of its members. And it was exactly this learning history that shaped the specificity and value of knowledge, as this knowledge couldn't easily be copied or transferred to other organizations. So the basis of the RBV. And these influences sharpened the insight in the community. I think that knowledge management does not just involve distributing, exchanging explicit knowledge, but has to be constructed, communicated again and again as an interactive process. So I don't know if, there's a little bit of time. We have another influence here in this phase, which I think was quite important because it was very eclectic and very practical. And it was taken up in many management contexts. And that was a milestone around the work of Peter Senge, the fifth discipline, which you all are aware of, the eclectic synthesis of organizational learning and knowledge management in his 5 disciplines: personal empowerment, mental models, shared visions, team learning, systemic thinking, and so on. And he complements, and this may be the more important thing, he complements these core disciplines with a diversity of methods and tools, such as dialogues, communicative learning, and you remember the toolbook. And you remember also David Bohm's conception of dialogues, which we now think is extremely important when we speak about awareness. And this was really the basis in Buddhistic and Zen meditation, also thinking about how can you be aware and reflect on your knowledge. Okay, I'm not going too far into this, but all of this, I think, makes clear that knowledge is a common process of sense-making and interpretation in this phase, which is about developing a common cultural basis and action orientation in organization in connection with strategies and systemic leadership. Knowledge as a classical resource is here supplemented by a very subjective meaning. I'm speaking of terminal values, to speak with Rockridge, and emotional context. So we don't just have an objective rational. When we speak about knowledge management, we have this whole emotional connotations going with it. And it also becomes apparent here that organizational knowledge is far more than the sum of individual knowledge. And this became clear to me when I was staying in the Japan Advanced Institute of Science and Technology with Nonaka, Professor Nonaka, and speaking about sort of this development of knowledge, how this is so strongly and closely connected to the problematic and the environmental context in which it's involved. Now, Peter Senge has a concept that he mentions as helicopter view, detaching oneself from one's point of view and looking at the questions, one assumptions together with others. So it's sort of a reflective awareness where you look at your assumptions and try to become clear of it. Now, interestingly enough, and I spoke to Nonaka about this, he had developed the concept with Takeuchi and others of ba. The ba concept, they never really they referred to each other. But these two concepts are very, very similar in a way, because also in the ba concept, you have shared knowledge space, which is developed and represents the basis for new knowledge development and insights. And so in this phase, we have now learning communities, collaborative learning as concepts which become more and more important. So the next step, I think, in the development is marked by influences which I'd like to label from pure distribution of knowledge to knowledge sharing. And here, due to the widespread availability of mobile access of the internet and social media, driven not at least by the Arab Spring, because in 2011, you remember, through Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, we have a grassroots participatory mobilizing force of social media. And we suddenly see, and especially dictators in the world over, see that information and knowledge is spreading unhindered in virtual space. So knowledge management now is no longer encompassed only over designable and controlled distribution of knowledge, but now implies largely unhindered, uncontrollable sharing of knowledge. So social networks, collaborations, co-learning disrupted previous channels of exchange and opened up completely new opportunities for knowledge sharing. So we find concepts such as collaborative indexing, instant messaging, collaborative writing, mashups, web forums, weblogs, wikis, jives, and also. And I remember when I met Leif Edvinsson in a meeting in Brussels, he suddenly said to me, you know what? I think that all of a sudden intellectual capital is not between the ears any longer, but it's in between people, between minds. And so it's a question of people's interaction where knowledge develops and intellectual capital develops. And these developments, I think they had a very strong and severe consequences for our management thinking. Knowledge sharing transcended corporate boundaries and freed itself from organizational control then. Numerous large companies, and I witnessed that very, very strongly personally in the German automotive industry, amongst others, with very strict information security standards, they were suddenly confronted with interactive practices that were really difficult to control. People were sitting in expert communities, they're having work out loud sessions in large supplier connections, and all of a sudden, or sitting in global communication networks, and they felt increasingly lost with their confidentiality policies in these companies. So hierarchy, power, professional authority became less and less important in knowledge development and knowledge sharing processes. So self-organizing knowledge sharing became a very important target of knowledge management. And this was taking place in, future centers, learning labs, dialogue houses, connects, meetings, work out loud sessions, and so on. And these were hard to control. And this new openness not only challenged traditional power-centered forms of dealing with knowledge, but also had a democratic effect on the institutional world as a whole. I remember Cisco coining the phrase from hierarchies to hierarchies, in order to focus on the network-based organization. And successful knowledge management here became increasingly clear, only works on a participatory basis and on the eye level. Traditional structures and hierarchies become increasingly dysfunctional all of a sudden. Maybe you remember, of course, who I'm speaking to, of course. In 2012, Gary Hamel called for reinventing management because old principles of management are no longer effective. Now, even if the resulting vision of his new management 2.0 from the hackathon that he made still seem largely utopian in the majority of today's company, a cultural change has occurred, not least through a generational change, and which supports the implementation and sustainable knowledge management and transparency more than ever before. So let's jump to the next phase where we are in the middle of which we are now. And I think this is being dominated by digitization, cognitive computing, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and social innovation. We heard a lot about that also yesterday. And to me, I just like to pick two trends here from the development, which I seem are important for development of knowledge management. One trend is it seems that KM is not only used as a means to boost business performance, but as an end in itself. That is, to monetize knowledge itself. We now witness a new level of monetization of knowledge. So the business strategies themselves are now becoming knowledge services, be it data from machine sensors, predictive maintenance, or data from health monitoring, real-time health monitoring, or data from mobile and social application with behavioral and consumption patterns, which we derive from that. And, with 5.2 billion mobile phones out there, completely new opportunities for identifying and using meta knowledge are currently emerging. We're networking people. We're developing Internet of Things with IBM's System of Insights. You're all aware of this. We have Network Machine Industry 4.0, Smart Factory, which is a very strong focus in Germany. They don't connect people so much, but they connect factories, which they find is much more effective. And this shows that the intangible resource knowledge can be monetized at a breathtaking speed. And thus is becoming a key driver for value creation in the areas of healthcare, environment, transportation, finance, and so on. Now, if we look, we know all that, but if we look with this knowledge extraction from big data and their use via algorithms and cognitive computing, new domains of power and influence develop extremely quick that do not need any consent from the people delivering the data anymore. So it's not a question of knowledge sharing being completely clear about I'm sharing my knowledge now at this point, but there's no consent necessary. We now see the application of expert models as a second phase with high computing power. IBM Watson is one of the first ones that use mental models of experience and cognitive analysis schemes from experts for continuous refinement and meta level data collections. Now, Watson basically showed us then that the search for disease causes, optimized investment decision, or menus or best practices can in HR can increasingly be transcended from the individual level through cognitive computing. Thus, while the core principle of knowledge sharing still remains as before, there is a crucial difference now. Sharing now is no longer subject only to voluntary decisions of individual, but is in part involuntary and covert. So this is touching a major problem, which I can't go into here now. We had a question yesterday, I think, from Konstantin, from you. I'm just touching this problem with regard to the origin of the data. Ownership rights are currently still largely completely unresolved. And the second trend, which to me is a very optimistic trend, is a trend alongside the monetization rationale of algorithms, a culture of sharing through trust, collaborative learning, with the goal of sustainability and social innovation. Now, patterns of aspiration along the younger generations, they change their values and their aspirations. Generation X, Y, Z, they grow louder. For many, return on investment as an end in itself is becoming completely unimportant or not important, with the negative external effects increasing dramatically at the moment. Climate, health, we all see that every day in the news. So this is also partly reflected in different funding policies. If you look at the Horizon funding, you are called in order to applicate or make an application. You're asked to position yourself with regard to responsible research and innovation. This was new. I mean, it was formal at that time, but it is a trend. And for example, the Global Knowledge for Development community is looking exactly at the very heart of these questions and trying to conceive a set of knowledge development goals based on the UN SDGs, 17 SDGs for the year 2030. So inevitably, the question arises here as to the interest in which knowledge management technology and information processing capacities are used. Thus, knowledge is now developing, in addition to its technical dimension, and strategic dimension is developing an ethical, a moral, and legal implications, which I find are very, very important for today's research and for continuous research. Now, let me jump to the second point of the agenda, and the other points won't take so long, so I'll just jump through them quite quickly. In my team, I asked one of the PhD students to prolong sort of this historical phase. And Stephanie made a bibliometric analysis. And this shows what you guys are doing at the moment. Those are the clusters of 5 years research publication in the leading journals, in the list of leading academic journals on knowledge management. Serenko and Bontis, they proposed in 2021 a list of 28 knowledge management journals. And we took these and looked at the clusters that evolved if you put in the last 5 years of publications. And you see these clusters evolving around the yellow cluster around knowledge sharing. You have a blue cluster, which is more people-oriented, knowledge acquisition, public sector orientation. You have a red cluster, which is mainly moving around intellectual capital, social networking. You have a green cluster, which is oriented towards innovation, knowledge transfer. And you have a purple cluster, the old guys with the organizational learning, with the trust issues, with knowledge hiding and motivation as aspects. So this is sort of, if you look at the conference program, you will find that these clusters are exactly in the conference program. So no wonder based on the Journal of Knowledge Management. And if you take out only the last years, the last 2 years, you find that the evolving issues, it's not very surprising, but as we all see, COVID-19, big data, and climate change, they're coming up in connection with these publications. All right, so what is the future? The future is always hard to predict, as we all know, and especially today in this turbulent environment field. So I'd just like to shortly focus on 4 fields, on 4 clusters, or on 4 fields, which I find, we as a group find are becoming more important. And it's those clusters we're working in as well. So it's no wonder, but I'm sure you can add on many other things. So I just quickly like to go into these clusters. I think one cluster is the knowledge management for societal development. The second is the focus on crisis and disaster management. The third is knowledge management in healthcare. And the fourth is the ISO 3401 as common conceptual standard. Now, maybe you're wondering why I'm taking up that, but I'll just quickly go into them and give you a short introduction into our thoughts here. So let's start off with the question of societal development. Now, along the trends that I've explained or that I've described, we have to be aware of a knowledge divide, or better said, of a knowledge disparity based on knowledge power, which is moving to a new level, knowledge management power. And here we face a very old dilemma, I think. But now in the context of a global context, in whose interest is information and knowledge being derived from that data? Is it the hyperscalers who, by means of jointly developing algorithms now, and I saw that in Brussels working with the EU Commission there, and IBM saying, okay, when it comes down to the boiling point, those algorithms, they're ours, we've developed them, but they're derived from public data. Now, the hyperscalers are decoding the DNA of societal knowledge and behavior at the moment from globally available data and use it in the sense of their corporate goals. Look at the formulas for vaccines and so on, the problem we have around the intellectual property there. Or is knowledge management and ECKM, unlike before, now also in the service of sustainable goals of our societal coexistence? So this, I think, are very important questions, and it's a very, very fine line and difficult line to ensure the protection of intellectual property on one hand, which we all find is important, and on the other hand, to put AI-filtered, exploding knowledge at the service of common goods of other people in the society. And possible frameworks here might be the UN SDG or Jacques Delors' ELI index, who might give a framework for this type of work, or compass. Sorry, I jumped there. Okay, the second topic, I think we think is very important. We've been working in this area since about 12 years, is crisis management. Now, hurricanes, pandemia, natural disaster, terror attacks, floodings, calls for high performance interventions. And let me give you the result. During these 12 years, we've really witnessed that knowledge management can make a difference. It's a vital solution for better performance of these teams. We've been analyzing now this is something now going off here without me wanting this to do. All right. Okay, we've been analyzing simulations in smaller and larger contexts with many injured persons and with large teams of about 5,000 persons intervening in order to cope with these accidents. And one thing becomes very, very clear. In more dynamic, highly turbulent and unclear defined situations, the old command control chain logics, they don't work anymore. We need decentralized organizational self-organizing principles, and the basis for these is knowledge and the transfer of knowledge into the periphery of a system. So if you have 5,000 actors in these crisis situations, you have to understand how knowledge management is a crucial issue. And this, I think, is a very important result. And at the moment, we're working with very different concepts where we try to introduce these self-organizing principles because they're very much opposed to these classic command control chain logics where people have to do what they're said. But the movement over the center, who then decides what is to be done, is extremely difficult and takes much too long time. So we're dealing with moving targets here. So the next point is we have to see when it comes to crisis management, we have to understand knowledge management in fighting this crisis and these disasters. The third field I, of course, shortly like to mention is ambulatory healthcare. Now, healthcare in general is a topic, and we see exploding knowledge going on. These are a couple of old studies I've referred to, but because they were very large studies, medical knowledge doubles around every 73 days, and growing knowledge divide and slow diffusion into ambulatory healthcare. Now, we have a project since about 4.5 years now, and we've looked at ambulatory healthcare, and there's absolutely, practically no knowledge management existent. And this in an area which is the most knowledge intensive area I would propose here. So the question is, how can we introduce knowledge management in a way that is affinate to this type of culture? Because medical personnel are not very affinitive of people coming in saying, okay, what you need now is knowledge management. But in this project, we've developed a model. We've developed a scorecard for ambulatory indicators, for performance indicators. And then we've developed 3 areas which are intervened with each other, which closely are connected, and you can't just take out one. And that is team management and leadership as a very important aspect for performance in ambulatory healthcare. Process and quality management as a second. And the third and most important one is information and knowledge management. And we're currently developing an app that is being funded in orders for ambulatory healthcare stations evaluating their own performance on the basis of these aspects. Okay, and the last point, I think this is a huge window of opportunity opening up. I hate certifications, but in 40 years of research in knowledge management, I've painfully missed a basic common conceptual framework to integrate and to derive new questions or insights from. So in 2018, the ISO 3401 was released, initially a British initiative, and it's a large window of opportunity, I think, because the standard integrates a highly diverse and heterogeneous literature. We just published in the Journal of Intellectual Capital an article where we look at the theoretical foundation of the ISO 3401, and it does have a sound theoretical basis, I think. And we have to provide evidence for things that work for practitioners. And this is written by practitioners, and we have to really take into the theoretical aspects into this norm and show them what works and what doesn't work. So the ISO 3401 can be a door opener, or as I say, a Trojan horse, even in areas that had so far little interest in knowledge management. So let's get them into the boat. This is a historical chance in an economy that fancies certification. So that's what I wanted to say to you. And let me just visualize at the end of my presentation why I think knowledge management is important. 2 years ago, I wrote a textbook on knowledge management, and you see that in the left picture. And if you go higher in your perspective, you see that it's connected to business management, which is knowledge management in Germany. So you find the right scale. So I think the ISO 3401 might be the scale looking at how knowledge management can work in the future, and also winning new target groups for knowledge management. Thank you for your attention. I hope I made it in time. Yes.